I am 68 years old. I am standing in my own kitchen, but I feel like a trespasser in a museum. The air smells like expensive pine needles and a cleaning solution that costs more than my first car. There is no scent of cinnamon. There is no scent of the slow-roasted brisket that has been the centerpiece of the Sterling family Christmas for 42 years. Evelyn, dear, a voice chirps from the doorway. I've rearranged the spice rack. It was looking a bit rustic. I've got ahead and digitized the pantry inventory. It's much more efficient. I turn slowly. There stands Brooke. 31 years old. Sharp bob. Teeth so white they look like they belong in a commercial for porcelain. She is married to my son, David. The son I raised on scraped knees and bedtime stories. The son who, for the last 2 years, has looked at me like I'm a piece of software that won't stop crashing. Brooke isn't just a daughter-in-law. She's a lifestyle architect. That's what her Instagram bio says. And this Christmas, she decided my home was her latest renovation project. The brisket, Brooke, I say, my voice steady, though my hands are shoved deep into my apron pockets to hide the slight tremor. It needs to go in the oven by 4 a.m. if we want it tender for tomorrow. Brooke gives a soft, pitying laugh. She walks over and pats my hand. Her skin is cold, perfectly manicured. Oh, Evelyn. We talked about this. Red meat is so heavy. It's not on the vision board for this year's gala. Gala? I ask. It's a family dinner, Brooke. It's Christmas Eve. It's a networking opportunity, Evelyn, she corrects me, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. David's firm is up for the regional partnership. We've invited the board of directors. I've hired a catering team. They'll be here at dawn. We're doing a deconstructed vegan tasting menu. I look at the counter. My grandmother's cast iron pot, the one that has survived the Great Depression and 3 house moves, is gone. In its place is a sleek, silver sous vide machine that looks like a medical device. Where is the pot, Brooke? In the donation bin, dear. It was chipped. Very unhygienic. I feel a sharp, cold prick behind my eyes. That pot wasn't just iron. It was the memory of my mother's hands. It was the history of a family that Brooke was currently erasing with a microfiber cloth. I look past her into the living room. The tree, the one we used to decorate with mismatched ornaments the grandkids made out of salt dough, is gone. Now, there is a minimalist installation. A white plastic cone decorated with nothing but black velvet ribbons. The children, I whisper. Where are the ornaments they made? In the attic, Brooke says, checking her gold watch. They didn't fit the aesthetic. We're going for industrial chic this year. It's about the future, Evelyn. Not the past. I look at David. He is standing by the window, staring at his phone. He hasn't looked at me once since they arrived this morning. He's wearing a sweater Brooke bought him. It's gray. It matches the walls. It matches the soul of this house right now. David, I call out. He looks up, but his eyes are distant. Mom, just listen to Brooke. She knows what she's doing. She's trying to help you. You're getting older. Managing a whole Christmas, it's a lot of cognitive load for you. Cognitive load. That was the phrase the doctor used last month when Brooke took me for a routine checkup that felt more like an interrogation about my memory. She wants the house. I know it. The house sits on prime real estate overlooking the valley. The house is the only thing standing between Brooke and the lifestyle she thinks she deserves. You're right, David, I say. I turn back to Brooke. She is smiling now. The smile of a predator who thinks the prey has stopped running. I'm so glad we're on the same page, she says. I've even taken the liberty of pre-filling the paperwork for the power of attorney. Just as a precaution. So you don't have to worry about the burden of the property taxes or the maintenance anymore. She slides a fountain pen across the marble island. The same marble island my late husband, Thomas, installed with his own 2 hands 40 years ago. I just want you to be able to sit back and enjoy the show, Evelyn, she says, leaning in. Her breath smells like peppermint and ambition. You've worked hard enough. It's time to let someone with a fresh vision take the wheel. I look at the pen. I look at my son, who won't meet my eyes. I look at the white plastic cone that replaced our family tree. I don't scream. I don't cry. I don't even argue. I pick up the pen. The paper feels thick, expensive. I sign my name. Evelyn Mary Sterling. Brooke snatches the paper before the ink is even dry. She looks at David and nods. It's done, she whispers. She thinks she just won. She thinks she just inherited a kingdom. I smile. It's a small, tight smile. The kind of smile a queen gives right before she orders the gates to be locked. Brooke, I say quietly. Yes, Evelyn? Now that you've taken control of everything. I just have one question. Brooke tilts her head, her eyes gleaming with the arrogance of the young. Of course, dear. Anything. Did you remember to check the sub-basement's secondary foundation logs before you updated the security encryption? Brooke's smile falters for a microsecond. The what? The house, I say, smoothing my apron. It's a very old house, Brooke. It has secrets. Deep ones. I built the security system with Thomas back in the 80s. Long before Symmetry OS was a thing. I'm sure the caterers can handle a few old pipes, Evelyn, she says, recovering her poise. Oh, it's not the pipes, I say, turning to walk toward the stairs. It's the ownership clause. I don't explain. I don't have to. I go up to my room and lock the door. I sit on the edge of my bed and reach for my old Nokia, the one Brooke told me to throw away because it was obsolete. I dial a number I haven't called in 20 years. It's Evelyn, I say when the voice answers. The takeover is complete. She signed the acceptance of liability. Trigger the audit. All of them. Brooke thinks she just took my home. She doesn't realize she just signed a document that makes her legally responsible for 40 years of creative accounting Thomas left behind. She wanted the cognitive load. Well, I'm about to give her the weight of a mountain. End of chapter 1. Description: Evelyn is 68, and her daughter-in-law Brooke has decided to modernize her life by taking over her home, her traditions, and her legal rights this Christmas. Brooke thinks she's being clever, but she's just walked into a trap 4 decades in the making. Evelyn has one question, and the answer will cost Brooke everything. Tags: Reddit life stories, family drama, revenge, daughter-in-law, Christmas stories, shocking twist, pro-revenge, malicious compliance, inheritance, family secrets, mother-in-law, justice served, betrayal, house takeover, legal battle. The house was quiet, but it was a jagged, artificial quiet. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the industrial chic lighting Brooke had installed in the garden. I could hear the muffled thud of footsteps downstairs. The catering team arrived at 4:30 a.m., their voices metallic and hurried. They were moving my furniture, scraping the legs of the antique mahogany sideboard against the hardwood floors. Brooke thought she was the architect of this new era. She thought by making me sign that power of attorney, she had inherited a gold mine. What she actually inherited was a litigation bomb. Thomas, my late husband, was a brilliant man, but he was a man of flexible ethics. In the 80s, when the valley was just starting to boom, he had brokered land deals that weren't exactly by the book. He had buried the liabilities deep in the secondary foundation logs of this very house, not physical logs, but digital ones, encrypted in a language Brooke's modern Symmetry OS couldn't even translate. By signing that acceptance of liability, Brooke hadn't just taken the deed. She had taken the debt. $14 million in back taxes, unrecovered environmental fines, and a lien from a holding company in the Caymans that had been waiting for a new signatory for 24 years. I checked my Nokia. A single text message blinked on the green screen, audit triggered. Enforcement in 12 hours. I stood up and walked to my vanity. I didn't look like a woman who had lost her home. I looked like a woman who had finally finished a very long, very exhausting shift. I brushed my hair, pinned it back into a neat, tight bun, and put on my favorite pearl earrings, the ones Thomas gave me the night we closed the Valley deal. I walked downstairs. The kitchen was a war zone of stainless steel and microgreens. 3 men in black tunics were hovering over the sous vide machine like they were performing open-heart surgery on a cauliflower. Brooke was there, a tablet clutched in her hand, barking orders into a headset. No, the foam needs to be drier. The board expects an experience, not a soup. She saw me and paused, her eyes scanning me for signs of defeat. Evelyn. You're up early. I've had the caterer set up a small gluten-free oatmeal station in the laundry room for you. It's out of the way of the flow. I smiled. It was the smile of a cat watching a mouse walk into a maze. That's very thoughtful, Brooke. Truly. The flow is very important. Exactly, she said, turning back to her tablet. David is already at the office. He's bringing the board members back here for the 6 p.m. toast. This house needs to look like the headquarters of a winner, Evelyn. Not a retirement home. A winner, I repeated. And the paperwork? The power of attorney? You filed it digitally already? 20 minutes ago, she said, with a smug tilt of her head. I don't leave things to chance. Thorn Industries is officially the manager of the Sterling estate. I've already authorized a $2 million renovation loan against the equity to pay for the new marble in the foyer. My heart skipped a beat. Not out of fear, but out of pure, cold satisfaction. You took out a loan? Against the equity? This morning? Speed is power, Evelyn, she said, tapping her temple. You wouldn't understand. It's called leveraging assets. I walked over to the coffee machine, one of the few things she hadn't replaced yet, and poured myself a cup. Leveraging assets. Yes. Thomas used to say the same thing. Usually right before he changed his phone number. Brooke laughed, a sharp, condescending sound. Well, Thomas didn't have my algorithms. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to ensure the minimalist installation in the foyer isn't leaning. Perfection is non-negotiable. She marched out of the kitchen, her heels clicking like a countdown. I sat at the small breakfast nook and watched the caterers. One of them was struggling with a blender. The power keeps dipping, he grumbled. Every time I hit pulse, the lights in the basement flicker. That's the secondary foundation logs, I said, sipping my coffee. The what? The young man asked. The house is waking up, I replied. He looked at me like I was senile. Brooke had done her job well, she had convinced everyone I was a ghost haunting my own hallways. At 10:15 a.m., the first bell rang. It wasn't a board member. It wasn't a florist. It was a man in a gray suit carrying a black briefcase. He looked like a tax auditor because he was a tax auditor. I watched from the top of the stairs as Brooke opened the door, her grand hostess smile firmly in place. Good morning. You must be the florist from Floratech. Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division, the man said, flashing a badge. I'm looking for the managing signatory of the Sterling estate. A Brooke Thorn? Brooke's smile didn't just fade, it evaporated. I'm sorry? There must be a mistake. This is a private residence. According to the filing made at 8:04 a.m. this morning, this residence is the primary collateral for Thorn Industries' recent equity loan, the agent said. And Thorn Industries is now the legal successor to Sterling Land Holdings. Which means, Ms. Thorn, you are currently responsible for the $14.2 million in undisclosed offshore liabilities we've been tracking for 2 decades. I leaned over the banister. Brooke turned white. 14 million? Plus interest, I said from the stairs. Brooke looked up at me, her tablet shaking in her hand. Evelyn? What is he talking about? You didn't say, the papers didn't mention. Oh, Brooke, I said, slowly descending the stairs. You told me you digitized the pantry. Didn't you think to digitize the basement archives before you signed the acceptance of liability? It's all there. In the rust dot. The agent looked at me. Mrs. Sterling? I'm just a guest here now, agent, I said, smoothing my dress. A retired occupant with no legal standing. Brooke is the lifestyle architect here. She handles all the cognitive load. Brooke stepped back, her heel catching on the edge of her minimalist white plastic tree. David, she screamed. David, get back here. But David wasn't coming. David was currently at the office, where 2 more agents were likely explaining why his regional partnership was about to be replaced by a federal subpoena. I walked past Brooke, past the pale caterers, and straight to the front door. Where are you going? Brooke hissed, her eyes wild with terror. I paused at the threshold. The air outside was crisp, smelling of real pine and fresh possibilities. I'm going to buy a cast iron pot, Brooke, I said. And then I'm going to a hotel. One that doesn't have an industrial chic aesthetic. I closed the door behind me. But I didn't leave just yet. I stood on the porch and waited. Because I knew the one thing Brooke hadn't checked. The one thing that was about to make her networking gala the most talked about event in the history of the valley. I looked at my watch. 3, 2, 1. The sound of the house's main breaker tripping was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The silence that followed the power failure was heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on the glass and steel foyer. Inside, I could hear the muffled chaos. The caterers were shouting about the sous vide machines losing temperature. The minimalist installation was a dark, jagged shadow in the center of the room. And Brooke, poor, ambitious Brooke, was standing in the middle of it all with a federal agent who didn't care about industrial chic. I didn't leave the porch. I sat on the antique swing Thomas had installed 40 years ago. It creaked rhythmically, a slow, steady heartbeat in the cold morning air. At 11:30 a.m., a black town car pulled into the driveway. David stepped out. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 4 hours. His tie was loosened, his expensive wool coat was unbuttoned, and his face was the color of wet sidewalk. He saw me on the swing and stopped. Mom, he whispered. What did you do? I didn't do anything, David, I said, my voice calm as a mountain lake. I simply retired. Isn't that what you and Brooke wanted? For me to let go of the cognitive load? The firm, they walked me out, Mom. 2 guys in suits met me at the elevators. They said Thorne Industries is under a federal freeze. They said the Sterling estate is being audited for land grab violations from 1988. He looked at the house, the dark, silent fortress. I didn't know about the 1988 deals, Mom. I swear. Thomas was a quiet man about his work, David, I said. But he left the records in the basement. I told Brooke to check the logs. She was too busy digitizing the spice rack. The front door flew open. Brooke stumbled out. Her perfect hair was coming loose, and she was clutching her tablet like a shield, even though the screen was black. David, she screamed. Fix this. This man says I'm responsible for $14 million. He says the equity loan I signed this morning triggered a mandatory succession audit. The IRS agent stepped out behind her, looking completely unimpressed. Mr. Thorne? I'm Agent Miller. Since your wife signed as the managing signatory and accepted the absolute liability clause in the power of attorney, she is currently our primary point of contact for the recovery of the Sterling arrears. David looked at Brooke. Then he looked at me. Absolute liability? David asked, his voice cracking. Brooke, you said the lawyer vetted the papers. I used an AI legal suite. Brooke shrieked. It said the language was standard for high asset transfers. Standard for people who know what they're buying, I added from the swing. Not for people who are trying to steal a house before the owner is cold. You trapped me, Brooke hissed, pointing a manicured finger at me. You knew those taxes were there. You sat in that kitchen and watched me sign my life away. I stood up from the swing. The movement was slow, deliberate. Brooke, dear, I said, walking toward her. You told me you were a lifestyle architect. An architect is supposed to check the foundation before they start decorating the penthouse. You wanted control. You wanted the keys. You wanted to be the one to make the hard decisions. I leaned in close, so close she could smell the peppermint tea on my breath. Welcome to the hard part. We'll fight it, David said, though he sounded like a man drowning. We'll use the $5 million in the trust. The trust Thomas set up? I asked, tilting my head. The one that requires the primary matriarch's thumbprint for any withdrawal over $50,000? David went silent. The trust you haven't touched in years because you were waiting for the right time? I continued. Well, that trust is still mine. It wasn't part of the estate transfer. I kept that rustic little piece of paper in my own safe. Brooke's jaw dropped. You have $5 million in a separate account? I do, I said. And I was going to use it to pay off the 1988 liabilities once I felt David was ready to handle the truth about his father. But then you arrived with your white plastic tree and your cognitive load theories. I looked at my son. You let her treat me like a ghost in my own home, David. You watched her throw away my mother's cast iron pot. You watched her put my grandchildren's ornaments in the attic because they didn't fit her aesthetic. Mom, No, I said, cutting him off. The time for Mom is over. Right now, I'm just a woman with a $5 million trust and a very nice hotel suite waiting for her downtown. Agent Miller cleared his throat. Miss Thorne, we need to move to the dining room. I have a team coming to begin the physical inventory of the assets. Since the power is out, we'll be doing it by flashlight. Inventory? Brooke gasped. The board is coming at 6 o'clock. The caterers? The caterers have already left, Brooke, I said, pointing to the 3 black vans speeding down the driveway. They don't work for free, and they certainly don't work in the dark. I walked down the steps, past my shell-shocked son and my trembling daughter-in-law. Evelyn. Brooke called out, her voice desperate. Where are you going? You can't just leave us here with him. I paused by my car. I'm going to a diner, Brooke. I'm going to order a very large, very un-vegan cheeseburger. And then I'm going to sleep in a bed with high thread count sheets that don't match the walls. I got into the car. Oh, and Brooke? I rolled down the window. What? She sobbed. The sub-basement foundation logs? They aren't just for the taxes. There's a leak in the secondary septic line that Thomas never fixed. It's set to overflow if the power stays off for more than 6 hours. I'd suggest moving that minimalist tree before the industrial chic gets a bit too authentic. I drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the IRS agent leading them back into the dark house. The sun was shining on the valley, and for the first time in 42 years, I didn't feel the weight of Thomas's secrets. I had passed the burden to someone who was dying to carry it. The hotel suite was a symphony of cream silks and quiet luxury. I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. Downstairs, in the hotel's bistro, I had eaten a steak so rare it would have made Brooke faint. I had finished it with a glass of red wine that cost more than her digital spice rack. I checked my phone. 6:14 p.m. The gala was supposed to be starting now. The board of directors, the men and women who held David's career in their hands, would be pulling up to the iron gates of the Sterling estate. But there would be no spotlights. There would be no deconstructed vegan foam. I imagined the scene, the sleek black Autos and Mercedes-Benz S lining the driveway, their headlights cutting through the pitch-black mountain air. David, standing on the porch with a flashlight, trying to explain why the most prestigious house in the valley looked like a tomb. And then, there was the smell. 6 hours without power meant the backup pumps in the sub-basement had died. The secondary septic line, the one Thomas had engineered to bypass the city's environmental sensors in the 80s, was now doing exactly what I warned Brooke it would do. It was reclaiming the house. My phone buzzed. It was a text from David. "Mom. Please. Brooke is having a panic attack. The agents are seizing the laptops. The board is here. They can smell the basement from the driveway. Help US." I didn't reply. I opened my laptop and logged into the private portal for the Sterling Trust. Balance, $5,240,118.42. I hit a button. Transfer authorized. I didn't send it to David. I didn't send it to the IRS. I sent it to a small, boutique law firm in the city that specialized in aggressive dissolution. Then, I called the lead partner, a woman named Diane who had been my bridge partner for 15 years. "Evelyn," Diane said, her voice sharp and professional. "The funds hit. Are we moving?" "We are," I said. "I want the incapacity filing Brooke tried to use against me turned back on her. If she signed a power of attorney accepting $14 million in debt without a forensic audit, she's either a criminal or legally incompetent. Either way, she shouldn't be managing a lemonade stand, let alone my estate." "And David?" I looked at a photo on the nightstand, a picture of David at 10 years old, holding a trophy and looking at me with pure, uncomplicated love. "David is an adult," I said, my voice hardening. "He chose the architect over the mother. Let him see what it's like to live in her design." I hung up. There was a knock on my hotel door. I opened it to find a courier holding a large, heavy box. It was the cast iron pot I had ordered from a specialty shop across town. It was seasoned, thick, and smelled of iron and heat. I placed it on the marble counter of the kitchenette. "Welcome home," I whispered. Meanwhile, back at the estate, the gala had become a crime scene. According to the neighborhood group chat, which was currently exploding with grainy photos, the board members hadn't even stayed for 5 minutes. The chairman of Thorne Industries had been photographed covering his nose with a silk handkerchief while David tried to lead him toward the dark foyer. The minimalist installation, the white plastic cone, had tipped over into the rising sludge in the basement hallway. Brooke was reportedly seen sitting on the curb, her $2,000 dress ruined, while an IRS agent tagged her Tesla for seizure. At 9 p.m., my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a call from the local precinct. "Mrs. Sterling? This is Officer Higgins. We've had a disturbance at the Sterling residence. Your son and daughter-in-law are involved in a physical altercation with a process server. We've taken them into custody for their own safety. They're asking for you to post bail." I took a slow sip of my wine. "Officer Higgins," I said. "I'm 68 years old. I've recently been told that the cognitive load of managing family drama is too much for me." I understand, ma'am. I've retired, officer. If they need bail, tell them to call the lifestyle architect. I'm sure she has a vision board for how to handle a night in a holding cell." I hung up and turned off my phone. I walked to the balcony and looked out at the valley. The Sterling estate was a dark smudge on the hill, stripped of its lights, stripped of its pretension. I had been the silent partner for 40 years. But silence isn't weakness. Silence is the sound of a trap being set. Tomorrow, the liquidation would begin. Tomorrow, the industrial chic would be replaced by foreclosure brown. And I was going to wake up, order room service, and start looking for a small, rustic cottage with a very large kitchen. A place where the only aesthetic that mattered was the smell of a slow-roasted brisket. The morning sun over the valley was pale and indifferent. I woke up at 7 a.m., not to the sound of a smart home alarm or a digital assistant's weather report, but to the silence of a high-end hotel. I ordered a breakfast that Brooke would have called clogging: thick-cut bacon, poached eggs, and sourdough toast with real, salted butter. While I ate, I opened my laptop. The local news was already buzzing. Smell of scandal, Thrawn Industries gala ends in police raids and environmental hazard. There was a grainy photo of David being led to a patrol car, his face shielded by his blazer. Another photo showed Brooke, her mascara running in black tracks down her cheeks, pointing wildly at a stack of seized laptops. The board of directors hadn't just left, they had issued a formal statement by 2 a.m. distancing themselves from the sterling liabilities. David's partnership wasn't just on hold, it was incinerated. My phone, which I had switched back on, chimed. It was Diane, my lawyer. Evelyn, she said, her voice crackling with professional glee. I filed the emergency injunction. Since Brooke signed the power of attorney claiming she was the sole managing signatory while you were supposedly mentally diminished, we're arguing fraud. Not against you, against her creditors. Explain, I said, leaning back with my coffee. She told the bank she had full authority to leverage the house's equity. But she didn't disclose the 1988 environmental liens because she hadn't done a title search. That's bank fraud, Evelyn. The bank is already pulling the $2 million renovation loan. They want their money back today. And the IRS? They've frozen every account tied to Thrawn Industries. Brooke's personal savings, David's 401k, everything. They're treating it as a unified criminal enterprise until the 88 arrears are cleared. Which they can't clear, I noted. Not without your $5 million trust, Diane said. Which, by the way, I've moved into a protected offshore holding. They can't touch it. You are the only person in the state with liquid cash right now. I hung up and checked the Symmetry OS remote app on my phone. I still had guest observer access. The house was a graveyard of data. I could see the internal temperature was dropping. The smart fridge was sending alerts that the deconstructed vegan foam was spoilage critical. The biometric locks were stuck in hard lockdown because the backup batteries had finally drained. Brooke and David were still in the holding cell. At 10 a.m., I took a taxi to the precinct. I didn't go to bail them out. I went to see them. The visiting room smelled of floor wax and despair. David looked up as I sat down behind the plexiglass. He looked small. He looked like the boy who used to cry when he lost his favorite toy. Mom, he croaked. Please. Tell them. Tell them it was a mistake. Brooke she wanted to impress the board. She didn't know about the money Thomas moved. I looked at him, really looked at him. David, she called me rustic. She told me I was a cognitive load. And you stood there and checked your phone while she threw my mother's heritage into a donation bin. I was trying to keep the peace, he yelled, his voice echoing. No, I said quietly. You were trying to keep the lifestyle. You liked the gray walls and the industrial chic because it made you feel like you'd outgrown the woman who gave you everything. You wanted the crown, David. But you didn't want the history that came with it. Brooke was brought in a moment later. She looked like a ghost of her Instagram self. Evelyn, she hissed, her eyes darting. You have to pay the bail. And the IRS lien. If you don't, they're going to take my car. They're going to take my firm. Your firm is already gone, Brooke, I said. The board pulled the charter this morning. And as for the house, well, the city just condemned it due to the septic overflow. It's an environmental biohazard now. Brooke began to shake. You did this. You planned the power failure. You planned the leak. I didn't plan the leak, Brooke. Thomas planned the leak 40 years ago as a failsafe against nosy auditors. You just happened to be the one holding the door open when it triggered. I stood up to leave. Wait. David shouted. What are we supposed to do? We have nothing. The bank is seizing the condo in the city. Every credit card is declined. I paused. I have a guest cottage, I said. It's small. It has one bedroom. It has an old wood-burning stove and a very manual spice rack. Brooke's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. We can stay there? We can start over? No, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. I'm moving into the cottage. I've already had my things moved from the attic of the Sterling estate. The cast iron pot is already on the stove. Then where do we go? Brooke asked, her voice trembling. You're lifestyle architects, aren't you? I asked, picking up my purse. Build a new one. I hear the industrial chic of a public shelter is very trendy this time of year. I walked out of the precinct. The air was getting colder. Snow was starting to fall, real snow, not the white glitter dust Brooke had ordered for the foyer. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address to the farmhouse. As we drove away, I looked back at the mountain. The Sterling estate sat there, dark and rotting, a monument to a man's greed and a young woman's hubris. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the only one left standing. The cottage sat on the far edge of the property, hidden by a thicket of ancient oaks that Brooke had once called visual clutter. It was small, built of fieldstone and cedar, and inside, the air was warm. I had spent the afternoon hauling the last of my clutter from the storage unit, the real ornaments, the ones with the children's fingerprints in dried dough, the heavy wool blankets my mother had knitted, and my grandmother's cast iron pot. I sat at the small pine table, the glow of a single lamp reflecting off the screen of my laptop. The Thorne Industries empire was officially in a free fall. Because the IRS had frozen their accounts, and because the bank had pulled the renovation loan due to the environmental biohazard status of the main house, David and Brooke were now personally liable for the contractors who had been working on the estate. And those contractors didn't care about lifestyle architecture. They wanted to be paid. My phone rang. It was David. He had apparently been released on his own recognizance, likely because he had no prior record and, more importantly, no money to flee. Mom, he sobbed. He wasn't yelling anymore. He sounded like he was huddled in a cold corner. They won't let us back into the house. The hazmat teams have yellow tape across the driveway. Brooke she's sitting in the car crying. We can't even get a hotel room. Every card is locked. I took a slow sip of tea. The car, David? You mean the Tesla that's registered to Thorne Industries? The one the IRS tagged for seizure this morning? Silence. Then a sharp, muffled gasp from his end. They're here, David whispered. There's a flatbed truck pulling up to the curb. Mom, please. Just 5,000. Just enough for a week at a motel and some food. I haven't eaten since yesterday. 5,000, I mused. That's exactly what Brooke spent on the minimalist installation for the foyer, isn't it? The white plastic cone? Mom, don't do this. I'm your son. You were my son when I was medically diminished, David? You were my son when you watched her sign a document that tried to strip me of my dignity? I didn't know the extent of it. I thought she was just organizing things. She was organizing my funeral, David. Social and financial. She just happened to trip over the shovel. I hung up. I didn't feel the maternal guilt Brooke had counted on. I felt the weight of 40 years of being the nice one. The nice one who stayed quiet while Thomas made his deals. The nice one who kept the peace while David grew into a man who valued a gray wall over his mother's heart. At 2 p.m., a knock came at the cottage door. It was Agent Miller from the IRS. He looked tired, his suit wrinkled from a long night of inventory. Mrs. Sterling, he said, stepping into the warmth. I'll be brief. We finished the preliminary audit of the 88 files we found in the basement archives. It's extensive. I imagine it is, I said, offering him a seat. The total liability, with interest and penalties, sits at $14.8 million. Thorne Industries, as the legal successor, is on the hook. But here's the thing. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. We found a separate set of ledgers. Encrypted. Thomas was clever, but he used a very specific hardware key. A key that seems to have been active as recently as 3 hours ago. I didn't blink. Is that so? Someone moved $5 million out of a sterling-linked trust just before the freeze hit the primary estate accounts, Miller said. The signature on the trust was yours, Evelyn. But the liability for the 88 deals, that was moved to the estate manager position in 2012. And who is the estate manager? I asked. As of yesterday morning at 8:04 a.m., Miller said, that would be Brooke Thorne. I leaned back, a small smile playing on my lips. Thomas was very thorough about succession planning, Agent. He always said the person holding the keys should be the one responsible for the locks. Miller let out a short, dry laugh. She walked right into it, didn't she? She signed the absolute liability clause without realizing it was tied to the 2012 Managerial Succession Act. She literally signed a contract saying she would personally indemnify the previous owners against any and all federal claims. She wanted to be the boss, I said. A boss takes the credit. A boss takes the blame. Miller stood up. The house is gone, Evelyn. The bank will foreclose on the land to recover the renovation loan. The IRS will seize the remaining assets of Thorne Industries. But your trust, the one you moved, that's clean. Technically, you didn't own the debt. She did the moment she pushed you out. Technically, I agreed. One more thing, Miller said at the door. Your son. He's technically an employee of the firm, not a director. He's not going to jail, but he is going to be destitute for a long, long time. Are you really going to let them sleep in the street? I looked at the cast iron pot on the stove. I have a very large attic in this cottage, Agent Miller, I said. And I have a very long list of chores that need doing. If they want a roof, they can earn it. But they won't be lifestyle architects here. They'll be the help. I closed the door. 10 minutes later, I saw them. Two figures walking down the long, snowy driveway. Brooke was carrying a single designer suitcase, her heels sinking into the mud. David was dragging his feet, his head bowed. They looked up at the cottage, the warm, glowing light in the window. I stood at the door, my grandmother's apron tied around my waist. They reached the porch, shivering, looking like two drowned rats. The car is gone, Brooke whispered, her voice broken. The house is taped off. We have nowhere else, Evelyn. I looked at them. I looked at the woman who had called me a cognitive load. There's a question I asked you yesterday, Brooke, I said. Do you remember it? Brooke nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. The foundation logs. No, I said. The other question. The one I asked right after you signed the papers. Brooke stared at me, confused. I asked if you were ready to take the wheel, I reminded her. Well, the wheel is broken. And the car is in the impound lot. I stepped back, opening the door just a crack. You can stay in the attic, I said. But the Symmetry OS doesn't work here. If you want to eat, you'll start by cleaning the mud off my porch. With your hands. Not an app. I saw the flicker of rage in Brooke's eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by a gust of freezing wind. She dropped her suitcase. She knelt. I smiled. And then I went back inside to check on the brisket. The attic was unfinished. It smelled of dry cedar and old newspapers. There was no Symmetry OS to regulate the temperature, only the rising heat from the wood-burning stove downstairs. I had provided 2 narrow cots, the kind you buy for a summer camp, and a single wash basin. There's no Wi-Fi? Brooke's voice was a jagged whisper. She was standing in the center of the attic, her ruined designer dress clinging to her shivering frame. The signal doesn't reach through the fieldstone walls, I said, leaning against the doorframe. Besides, David's phone was seized, and yours is roaming on a data plan you can no longer afford. I'd suggest you turn it off to save the battery for emergencies. David was sitting on one of the cots, his head in his hands. He looked like he was trying to wake up from a dream that had turned into a charcoal sketch. Mom, he croaked. The house, the IRS told us they're putting up a forced sale sign tomorrow. They said because Brooke signed as the primary successor, they can go after her personal assets first. Her jewelry. Her handbags. Even her trust from her parents. My parents' trust is protected. Brooke shrieked, her eyes darting to her single suitcase. Not if you used it as a proof of funds for the renovation loan, I said calmly. Which you did. I saw the bank's digital trail. You pledged your personal portfolio as a guarantee to get that $2 million faster. Brooke collapsed onto the other cot. The spring let out a sharp, metallic groan. I was going to pay it back, she sobbed. I was going to flip the estate. I had a contract with a luxury magazine for a 10-page spread. The rebirth of the Sterling Manor. The only thing being reborn is the debt, Brooke, I said. Now, dinner is at 6 p.m. If you want a plate, the woodpile is behind the shed. It needs to be stacked by height. David, you handle the heavy logs. Brooke, you can sweep the porch. There's still mud from your heels. I didn't wait for an answer. I closed the attic door and locked it, not to keep them in, but to keep the boundary clear. For the next 2 hours, I sat in my armchair and listened. Thud. Scrape. Thud. The sound of David struggling with the oak logs was rhythmic. He had spent his adult life in air-conditioned offices, clicking buttons and leveraging assets. Now, he was leveraging his own hamstrings. Swish. 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 Brooke was sweeping. I could hear her muttering under her breath, a low hiss of resentment. She probably thought this was a temporary setback. She probably thought that by tomorrow, she'd find a loophole or a friend who would bail her out. She didn't realize that in the valley, friends vanish the moment the IRS agent flashes a badge. At 6 p.m., there was a tentative knock on the kitchen door. They walked in, looking battered. David's palms were red and blistering. Brooke's hands were gray with dust. Is it ready? David asked, eyeing the cast-iron pot on the stove. Sit, I said. I ladled out 3 bowls of stew. It wasn't vegan. It wasn't deconstructed. It was thick, hearty, and smelled of the earth. They ate in a silence that was almost painful. Brooke reached for the salt shaker, a small, ceramic hen my granddaughter had painted. Be careful with that, I said. It's a rustic relic. Wouldn't want it to ruin your aesthetic. Brooke froze, the shaker midair. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw the old arrogance flare up in her eyes. You're enjoying this, aren't you? She whispered. Watching us crawl? You're a monster, Evelyn. You let us walk into a trap. A monster? I laughed, a soft, dry sound. Brooke, you came into my home and tried to erase my life. You told my son I was a burden. You tried to put me in a facility so you could sell my memories for a profit. I didn't set a trap. I just stopped holding the door shut for you. We can still sue, Brooke said, her voice gaining a desperate edge. The incapacity filing. Diane, my lawyer, is currently filing a countersuit for elder abuse, I interrupted. And since you've already signed the power of attorney claiming I was incompetent, you've admitted to taking legal advantage of a vulnerable senior. That carries a mandatory prison sentence in this state, Brooke. Unless. David looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Unless what, Mom? Unless you go to the IRS tomorrow and sign a full confession. Admit that you acted alone. Admit that you manipulated the files. Clear the sterling name of the 2026 fraud, and I might not push for the elder abuse charges. But if I confess to the fraud, I'll never work in finance again. Brooke gasped. You weren't working in finance, Brooke, I said, leaning forward. You were working in vanity. And that business is closed. The phone on the counter rang. It was the landline, the old rotary phone that Brooke had begged me to replace with a smart hub. I answered it. Evelyn? It's Miller. The IRS agent's voice was grim. We just finished the sweep of the sub-basement. We found a safe. A real one. Behind the secondary septic line. My heart hammered against my ribs. Thomas had never told me about a safe. And? I asked. It's not full of money, Evelyn. It's full of tapes. Microcassettes. From 1988. There are names on these tapes. Names of the people Thomas was paying off. People who are currently sitting on the board of directors at Thorne Industries. I looked at David. He was staring at me, his spoon halfway to his mouth. Agent Miller, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Do the tapes mention the architectural oversight clause? They mention everything, Miller said. Including the fact that the chairman of the board was the one who suggested the illegal bypass in the first place. I hung up the phone. The trap hadn't just caught Brooke and David. It had caught the entire valley. I looked at Brooke, who was still clutching the salt shaker. Change of plans, Brooke, I said. You're not going to the IRS tomorrow. You're going to the chairman's office. And you're going to tell him that if he doesn't personally cover the $14 million debt, I'm going to play the music Thomas left behind. Brooke stared at me, her mouth agape. Now, I said, pointing to the sink. Wash the dishes. Use the lemon soap. It's better for the cognitive load. The morning air was so cold it felt like inhaling needles. I sat at the pine table, watching Brooke. She was wearing a borrowed wool coat that was 2 sizes too big for her, her eyes rimmed with red from a night spent on a camp cot. She looked nothing like the lifestyle architect who had marched into my home 72 hours ago. The chairman's office, Brooke whispered, her hands shaking as she held a cup of black coffee. Evelyn, you don't understand. Arthur Sterling, he's not just the board chair. He's the one who authorized the 88 bypass. He'll bury me before I even reach the elevator. He won't bury you, Brooke, I said, sliding a small, silver microcassette recorder across the table. Because you're going to play the first 30 seconds of tape 04. It's the one where Arthur explains exactly how much he's going to kick back to Thomas for handling the environmental inspectors. David, who was sitting on the floor by the wood stove, looked up. Mom, you're sending her into a lion's den. Arthur is dangerous. He has a security team that could make us disappear. Arthur is a businessman, David, I replied, not looking at him. And a businessman knows when a debt has become too expensive to ignore. If he pays the $14.8 million to the IRS, the audit stops. The 88 files get sealed as a closed administrative error. If he doesn't, well, I've already sent a digital copy of the inventory list to a journalist at the Valley Chronicle. Brooke picked up the recorder. She looked at it like it was a live grenade. What do I tell him? Tell him the managing signatory of the Sterling estate is prepared to sign a non-disclosure agreement, I said. But only if the Sterling name is cleared of all liabilities and the deed to the main house is returned to me, unencumbered. No loans. No liens. Just a clean title. And what about us? David asked. You? I asked, raising an eyebrow. You're still the lifestyle architects, aren't you? You can build your new life with whatever's left of your reputation. Which, I suspect, will be roughly the same size as that salt dough ornament you threw away. Brooke stood up. She straightened her coat. For a brief second, a flicker of her old ambition returned to her eyes. She wasn't fighting for me, she was fighting for her own survival. If I do this, she said, you drop the elder abuse charges. Permanently. Signed and notarized the moment the deed is in my hand, I promised. I watched through the window as they walked down the driveway toward the main road. Since their cars had been seized, they had to take the local bus, a 3-mile walk in the snow to the nearest stop. I went to the basement of the cottage. It wasn't a sub-basement. It didn't have septic leaks. It was just a small, dry room filled with boxes of Thomas's old blueprints. I sat on a wooden stool and opened a blue folder marked 1988, the bypass. Thomas hadn't just kept tapes. He had kept the original engineering stamps. The stamps that showed the chairman had personally signed off on the illegal drainage system. Thomas hadn't been flexible with his ethics because he was greedy. He had been flexible because he was terrified. Arthur Sterling had held a mortgage over Thomas's head for 20 years. I wasn't just getting my house back. I was finishing the war my husband was too afraid to fight. At 1 p.m., my phone rang. "It's Brooke," she said. Her voice was trembling, but there was a strange, jagged edge of triumph in it. "I'm in the lobby of Thorne Industries." I played the tape. "And?" He turned gray. "Evelyn." He looked like he was having a stroke. He took me into his private study. He's calling the IRS attorneys now. He's going to frame it as a voluntary correction of a legacy accounting error. "Is the deed paperwork ready?" "His lawyers are drafting the transfer now," Brooke said. Then she paused. "Evelyn. Arthur asked me something. He asked how you knew about the architectural oversight clause. He said only 3 people ever knew about that." "I was the one who typed the contracts, Brooke," I said, my voice cold. "Thomas thought I was just his secretary. Arthur thought I was just the fragile wife. They both forgot that a secretary sees everything." "He wants to speak to you," Brooke added. "Tell him I'm busy," I said. "Tell him I'm seasoning my cast iron pot. If he wants to talk, he can wait until the 2026 audit is over." I hung up. I could feel the shift in the air. The lifestyle that Brooke and David had tried to build on the ruins of my life was officially over. But the real twist was yet to come. Because I hadn't told Brooke everything. I hadn't told her that once the deed was back in my name, and once the $14.8 million was paid by Arthur, the Sterling estate was no longer going to be a residence. I had already signed a deal with the local historical society. The main house, the industrial chic monument to greed, was going to be gutted and turned into a community center for displaced families. A place for people who actually needed a home. And as for David and Brooke? I looked at the clock. They would be back by dark. And they would find that the attic door wasn't just locked. It was gone. By 5:30 p.m., the snow was falling in thick, heavy curtains that swallowed the light of the valley. I sat by the wood-burning stove, the orange glow flickering against the walls of the cottage. On the table lay a single, manila envelope. Inside was the deed, clean, unencumbered, and officially transferred back to Evelyn Mary Sterling. Arthur had paid. The IRS had retreated. The $14.8 million legacy error was settled. The front door of the cottage pushed open, bringing in a swirl of freezing air and 2 exhausted figures. Brooke and David looked like ghosts. Their expensive shoes were soaked through, and their faces were raw from the wind. "We did it," Brooke gasped, leaning against the doorframe. She held up a folder of signed documents. Arthur signed everything. The deed, the non-disclosure, the liability release. "It's over, Evelyn. We're clean." I didn't get up. I didn't offer them tea. "The Sterling name is clean," I corrected her. "You and David? You're just unemployed." "But the house?" David stepped forward, his eyes bright with a desperate kind of hope. "Now that the deed is back, we can move back in. We can fix the septic. We can restart the firm. I've already been texting some of the junior partners. If we tell them the audit was just a misunderstanding." "The house is gone, David," I said, my voice as cold as the night outside. "What do you mean?" Brooke snapped. "You have the deed right there." "I have the deed," I said, tapping the envelope. "And I've already signed it over to the Valley Historical Trust. They're taking possession at midnight. It's going to be a transitional housing center for single mothers. The industrial chic aesthetic is being gutted as we speak. They're putting in real kitchens. Real nurseries." The silence that followed was absolute. Brooke's face didn't just go pale, it went gray. You gave it away," she whispered. "That house is worth $12 million. That was our future. It was my past, Brooke. And it was built on a foundation of lies and toxic waste. I don't want to live in a monument to Thomas's fear or Arthur's greed. And I certainly don't want to live in a house where my daughter-in-law tried to bury me alive. Where are we supposed to go? David yelled, his voice cracking. Everything we have is tied to that estate. Our furniture, our clothes, our entire lives are in those rooms. The historical trust is keeping the furniture, I said. They needed the minimalist pieces for the common areas. As for your clothes? I had them packed into those 4 suitcases by the door. Your Symmetry OS tablet is in there too. It's out of battery, but I'm sure you can find a charging station at the bus terminal. I stood up. I looked at my son, the man I had raised, who had stood by and watched a stranger try to dismantle his mother's soul. I've spent 40 years protecting you from the truth about your father, David. I thought I was being a good mother. But I realized I was just raising a man who didn't know the value of a foundation. You wanted the architecture without the engine. Well, now you have neither. Mom, please, David sobbed, reaching for my hand. We have no money. No car. Nothing. You have $5,000, I said, sliding a small envelope across the table. It's the exact amount you spent on the vision board for the gala. Use it wisely. It's the last cent you'll ever get from the Sterling Trust. Brooke stepped toward me, her teeth bared in a snarl. You think you've won? We'll find a lawyer. We'll contest the donation. You're 68. We'll prove you weren't in your right mind. I picked up the microcassette recorder. Go ahead, Brooke, I said. But the moment you file a motion, I release the rest of the tapes. Not the ones about the taxes. The ones about you. The recordings of our consultation where you discussed which facility was the cheapest for medically diminished seniors. The one where you joked about how lucky it was that Thomas died before he could stop you. Brooke froze. Her eyes went wide. She hadn't realized I was recording her the entire time she was renovating my life. I'm an old woman, Brooke, I said, leaning in. But I'm an old woman who spent 40 years keeping the books for a man who outsmarted the FBI. You were playing checkers. I was playing for the house. I pointed to the door. The taxi is waiting at the end of the driveway. It's paid for. It will take you to the station. If I see either of you on this property after midnight, I'm calling the sheriff to report an unstable intruder. David. Brooke screamed, turning to her husband. Do something. David looked at me. Then he looked at the suitcases. Then he looked at the cold, dark night. He didn't say a word. He picked up 2 of the bags and walked out the door. Brooke stayed for a moment, her chest heaving, her eyes full of a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. I'll see you in hell, Evelyn, she spat. Probably, I said, turning back to my stove. But I'll be the one holding the iron pot. Now, close the door. You're letting the heat out. The door slammed. I sat back down. The house was silent again. I reached for my phone and dialed Agent Miller. It's done, I said. The deed is transferred. The evidence is ready for the second phase. Are you sure you want to go through with the board purge, Evelyn? Miller asked. It's going to take down the whole firm. The firm was built on rot, Miller. It's time to clear the land. I hung up. I was 68 years old. I was alone in a small cottage in the middle of a blizzard. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a man to tell me what to do. I picked up my grandmother's cast iron pot. The real work was just beginning. The morning after the eviction was blindingly bright. The storm had passed, leaving the valley buried under 2 feet of pristine, white silence. I sat on my porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, watching the first of the moving vans pull into the driveway of the main house. They weren't moving furniture in. They were moving the rot out. I saw the minimalist installation, that expensive, hollow plastic cone, tossed into a dumpster like the piece of trash it always was. I saw the gray velvet curtains being ripped down to let the real sunlight back into the rooms. My phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Breaking: Thorne Industries chairman Arthur Sterling resigns amidst federal investigation. Board of directors dissolved. The tapes had done their work. Once the IRS had the microcassettes and the engineering stamps, the chairman didn't even try to fight. He knew the paper trail I had kept for 40 years was a noose he couldn't slip. By noon, the company's stock had plummeted to nearly zero. Thorne Industries wasn't just a firm anymore. It was a cautionary tale. At 1 p.m., a black car pulled up to the cottage. It wasn't a taxi. It was a sleek, modest sedan. Out stepped Diane, my lawyer, and Agent Miller. They walked up the porch steps, their breath misting in the air. "It's over, Evelyn," Diane said, handing me a final set of notarized documents. "The Sterling name has been legally detached from the Thorne liabilities. You are officially the sole owner of the Sterling Trust, the cottage, and the land surrounding it. And the Historical Society has confirmed the first 3 families are moving into the manor house on Monday." "And Brooke and David?" I asked, though my heart didn't flutter at the names. Agent Miller checked his tablet. "They're at a mid-range motel near the bus station. Brooke tried to use her remaining influence to get a suite on credit, but the manager recognized her from the news. They're currently sharing a single room. David was seen looking for work at a local construction site this morning." "Construction," I mused. "Good. He needs to learn how to build something that doesn't fall down when the lights go out." "And Brooke?" "She's been served with a lifetime ban from the Valley Financial District," Miller said. "And we're keeping the elder abuse file open for 5 years. If she so much as looks at a senior citizen's bank account, she's going straight to a federal cell." I stood up, the blanket slipping from my shoulders. "Thank you, both," I said, "for helping an old woman clear her house." "You didn't need much help, Evelyn," Miller said with a respectful nod. "Most people your age are worried about their gardens. You just took down a multi-million-dollar criminal board with a tape recorder and a cast-iron pot." I watched them drive away. I walked inside the cottage. It was warm, smelling of the brisket that had been simmering for 6 hours. I walked to the kitchen and looked at the wall where I had pinned the salt dough ornaments. There was a new one there, a small, clay handprint from one of the women who would be moving into the manor house. She had sent it to me as a thank you note. I sat down at the table. I am 68 years old. I have a small house that I love. I have a trust that will ensure my grandchildren, if David ever grows up enough to bring them back to me, will never have to sell their souls for a promotion. And I have the peace that comes from knowing that the cognitive load is finally balanced." I picked up my pen. I didn't have any more contracts to sign. No more blackmail to record. I opened a notebook. On the first page, I wrote a single sentence. "The foundation is finally solid." I looked out the window. The manor house on the hill was glowing with new lights. They weren't industrial chic. They were warm, yellow, and full of life. I smiled. And then, I finally sat down to eat my dinner.